We're coming live to you from Zoom in Israel for a special shir for in honor of Pesach. And just a couple of shout outs. This is normally part of the Origins of Tefillah course that I'm teaching with the support of Emma Phillips and Young Israel of North Netanya Inspire. And it also comes on the heels of teaching this somewhat of the same shir in Zichron Yaakov live from the Nevei Baron synagogue that has a very nice miklat. And luckily, we didn't get any sirens while we were learning about the Seder last night. I also just wanted to dedicate this shir for the Chayalim who have been going into Lebanon. And I have a few names here, and if you want to add any names, please do. Let's learn in their zchut that they should be safe and sound. Nadav Moshe ben Elisheva, Itai David ben Elisheva. We also have Betzalel Reuven ben Eliza. And here locally in Zichron, we've been davening very hard for the recovery of Matan Mordechai ben Meira. Okay, we are a week before Pesach. And even in Israel, we have finally come out of denial, actually the Nile. And we can talk a little bit about the Seder and get ourselves ready. So the reason I wanted to teach this in the context of Tefillah is we have already established in our Tefillah course, both here and in Zichron, that while the Siddur is one of the most owned Sefer, most owned Jewish book, most acquired Jewish book in the history of Judaism, it doesn't matter what home you walk into, 90% of the time, if you walk into a home of someone who identifies Jewishly, they will have either on their bookshelf or will have owned at some point a Siddur. And one of the things that we've grappled with in this class is that given the fact that Judaism is such an ancient religion, given the fact that the Torah is such a pivotal ancient basis for everything that we do as Jews and everything we respond to as Jews, Tefillah is no less central to Judaism. And so one of the shocking things to realize is that Siddur, whether it's Art Scroll or whether it's a more modern version of the Siddur, doesn't matter. That Siddur, the basis of it, the roots of the Siddur we cannot date it earlier than the 8th or 9th century. And so to think that for such a central aspect of Judaism, as tefillah is, as davening, as prayer, Jewish prayer is, to think of the fact that the Siddur is so relatively recent and coming into the Jewish canon of literature is quite shocking. So as shocking as that is, and as surprising as that is, I remember seeing a poll, this is from about 10 years ago, and it probably has gone down, but I remember seeing a poll that in North America, something like more than 80% of people who identify as Jewish, that means that they can come from any range or anywhere on the spectrum of affiliation, go to at least one Seder, every year. So of course, in North America, there's usually traditionally two, and the Seder that they're going to may not be exactly when traditional Jews say that this is the night of the Seder. They may go to it a week later or 2 weeks later, but there's some aspect of their identity that draws them to a Seder. And it crosses all denominational, religious, and political lines, cultural lines. And if you would ask, any Jew, no matter what their affiliation is, if you would ask them, what do you read? What is the focus of your Seder? They probably would say the Haggadah. They would know the word Haggadah, and they would know that it refers to the book that is the guide for the Seder. And yet, just like the Siddur, something that is so central to the way that we practice Judaism today, something so central to it. We don't have actual compilations of what we call the Haggadah until Saadia Gaon's Haggadah in the 9th century, 10th century, maybe some compilations of it in the 8th century. Again, the Haggadah that we use at the Seder, just like the Siddur, it doesn't mean that Tefillah didn't exist before the Siddur was actually compiled. We know from our class that versions of the Tefillah and versions of Shemona Esrei existed for a long time. It's just that idea, both with the Siddur, that's just like a Seder, both of the idea of the standardization of some sort of book that we're going to use or some sort of reference that we're going to use in our Tefillah, just like the Haggadah. And just like the Siddur, that Seder, that ordering and structure and standardization is relatively late. The other thing that is really, can really surprise people is and I did this last night, I put people on the spot. If I would ask you, who in this room has zero experience or close to no experience with Mishnah or Talmud or rabbinic literature? Everyone on this call would say, no, we have some experience. I've taken some classes, but you'd be surprised. You can go into a lot of different gatherings of people who identify Jewishly, and their automatic response will be, I have no background in Talmud. I have no background in Mishnah. I've never taken a class. And then I can look at them and say, you're lying. Because if you've gone to a Seder and you've had any interaction with the Haggadah, that Haggadah, most of it is based on Mishnah. Most of it is based on the Mishnah. And that's how the Haggadah came to be, is the discussion in the Mishnah, not even the Gemara. As early as the Mishnah, we have a discussion of what is going to go into this Haggadah. So as an example, and just to put it into perspective, okay, what was the central way of celebrating Passover? What was the central way of marking Pesach until the destruction of the Second Temple? So from the time, say it again?
The Korban Pesach.
Exactly. The Korban Pesach was the central way of marking the holiday. So just to get us all on the same page, the Korban Pesach was sui generis, okay? If we look at the different kinds of korbanot, the different kinds of sacrifices that happened during the First Temple and the Second Temple, they fall into categories, general categories. There's an olah, there's an asham, which is a guilt offering, a chet, which is also a sin offering, and there's a shlamim. There's a general, everyone gets to participate type of sacrifice. So the Korban Pesach fell into that category. It fell into the category of shlamim, but it was absolutely unique. Okay, so the practice around it was absolutely unique. The preparation for the actual pinnacle moment of the Korban, of the holiday of Pesach, happened before the holiday even began. It happened on the 14th of Nisan, when everybody would bring their sacrifices. They would bring their lambs and animals to the Beit HaMikdash and to the temple, and they would participate. It was a communal participation. Someone was sitting there, a Kohen was sitting there with a clipboard. And what I mean by communal is that people had to join. They were forced to join chavurot. So unlike our seders, where, we're very particular about who comes and who doesn't come and what the avirah, what the spirit is going to be around the table, here there was an absolute need to match people up. Because in my family, thank God, we have 6 people who are part of the, actual family. We have 4 children. If we would come up to the Kohen with the clipboard on Erev Pesach with our sacrifice, and we come with a big lamb for our Korban Pesach, for our sacrifice, the Kohen would probably say, hey, listen, Friedmans, 6 of you have to match up with another family. Why would the Kohen say that? Why was it so integral that there was this chavurah, there was matching of families and matching of this communal meal. The first reason is because that's what made the Korban Pesach sui generis. It was unique in its shlamim category. Why was it unique? Because part of the aspect of the sacrifice was that it all had to be consumed. And if it was not all consumed by a certain hour, and of course there's a debate as to when that hour was, but let's say by the next morning, it all had to be consumed. And if anything was left, it had to be burned. Okay? So there was no point in wasting food. Nobody wants to waste a good barbecue. And so if I came with my lamb, they would say, hey, listen, why don't you get together with the Phillips family, and you guys eat it together. So there was this enforced communal aspect to the Korban Pesach, which is important. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is because I want to just kind of talk about what the centrality and experience was of Passover for everyone leading up to the destruction of the temple. Leading up to the destruction of the temple, of course, there was a Seder insofar as there was discussion. There was a discussion about Yetziat Mitzrayim. There was obviously this idea that you were supposed to tell the story about Yetziat Mitzrayim, about leaving Egypt, but the central aspect was the Jerusalem experience. It was going to Jerusalem, being part of this sacrifice, being together with your family, being together as a community, and celebration of this, of leaving Egypt. But it was really more a celebration of the sacrifice itself, which is why if you ever look at Tractate Psachim, which you can guess, Tractate Psachim is about Pesach, but it's not about Pesach. That Talmudic Mishnah and Gemara is 90% about the Korban Pesach. You have to get through 10 long chapters of Masechet Psachim until you get to any conversation about the Seder. And it's from that 10th chapter, it's from that 10th chapter that we find so many different references to the Haggadah that we know and love. So Ronnie is asking, what do I mean by consumed? And I know there was a second question that popped up there too. How much was actually eaten rather than offered to the Almighty? What makes a shlamim interesting, Ronnie, is that it's entirely eaten by the people who participate in it. So the shlamim, I believe most of the shlamim I think most of the Korban Pesach, and I might be wrong here, 100% of the Korban Pesach was eaten by both the Kohen, the Levi, and the people bringing it. So none of it was offered up, except for maybe, I don't want to be gross, but except for maybe the entrails and things like that. But I don't even think that. I think that the lamb was roasted as a whole on pomegranate sticks, and then it was sacrificed in a different way too. It wasn't sacrificed necessarily on the Mizbeach. Even though I've spent a lot of time learning this, because it's not something we do, I've forgotten a lot of the details, but it was very different than other korbanot, other sacrifices. So we finally get to the 10th parak, the 10th chapter of Tractate Psachim, and guess what we see in the first Mishnah, the first couple of Mishnahs? We see that the rabbis start to talk about the fact that the Seder, that there should be a Seder. It's not just about the sacrifice. There should be some sort of context where we talk about, there's Sipor Yetziat Mitzrayim. We talk about leaving Egypt. And then the rabbis give us a template. And that template is called Manishtana. That template, that's how you're supposed to, that is the first place where we see some kind of standardization and some kind of structure given to what we know of as the Haggadah. And in fact, if we look at our Haggadot, the first thing that you see when you get to Magid, which is the most fun part of the Seder, the first thing you see is Manishtana. When you have a child ask these questions, these formulaic questions. Of course, there's Halach Ma'anya that comes first, of course that. And Halach Ma'anya actually goes back to rabbinic times, but not to this Mishnah. The Mishnah says you start with Manishtana. Now, why would you start with Manishtana? What does Manishtana do for the Seder? What kind of structure does it set forth for the Seder right from the bat? one right from the get-go. Yes, go ahead, Rachel. 4 questions. Yes, it gives us 4 questions. Yes, but what does it do for the purpose? What does it contribute to the purpose, or what does it reflect in terms of what the purpose is for the Seder? Go ahead, Rachel.
Well, to get the people around interested in what's going on, to start a discussion. Why we
Exactly. Exactly. So thank you very much. So it gets everybody engaged. So even though a child is supposed to ask it, and the Gemara actually, the Mishnah actually goes into details about it, and Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, remember the Mishnah Torah, he goes into details about this as well, which is that um, uh, uh, even if that it's the parent's obligation, we interpret that as parent today, it's the parent's obligation to make sure that their child asks these questions, and then it's up to the parent to answer those questions. And then, of course, the Haggadah. What is the Haggadah? The Haggadah is basically suggestions on how to answer those questions. The Mishnah says you're supposed to start with Shevach, and you're supposed to start with Gnut and end with Shevach. You're supposed to start with the lowest point and end with the highest point. And there's a whole other shir about that, about how you start with the low point and end with the high point. And that's also interesting. We could talk about that next year. But in terms of the rest of the Haggadah, basically follows the guidelines of Manishtana. And the rabbis even go into detail and say, let's say you're a parent and you don't have a child at home. So then what are you supposed to do at the Seder? So the answer is you're supposed to talk with your spouse and the two of you. This was happening during COVID, right? There were a lot of people where they were alone. They didn't have their kids around. So hopefully they had someone who they could ask those questions to, and they had to actually ask the questions. And Rambam says, what if you're alone? What if it's during COVID and you don't have your spouse with you, or you don't have anybody else with you, and you're by yourself? The Rambam says in Mishnah Torah, you ask the questions to yourself out loud. So that means that it's all about engaging yourself. Okay, it's all about talking and discussing. Even if it's yourself, there's an active aspect to sipur. There's an active aspect to telling. Okay. So I want you to put that in the back burner. We've established for a few things so far. We've established that the Haggadah is a latecomer to the canon of Jewish books, just like the Siddur. We've established that the guidelines for the Haggadah come from the rabbis. It comes from the Mishnah, and especially from Manishtana and the aspects about it. And we've also established that until the destruction of the temple, while it was still a positive commandment, it was still considered a mitzvah to talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim. Probably one of the reasons there was no Haggadah is because what took center stage was the korban. What took center stage was the sacrifice. And we see that in terms of the literature. The literature, 90% of it is dedicated to the sacrifice. Even people who are learning tractate Psachim today, very rarely do they get all the way to, they get there at the end, but most of their time is spent talking about a korban that is no longer existing. And so obviously, I would say we would all come to the conclusion that the reason the Haggadah emerged the way it emerged was because there no longer was a korban, and you didn't want people kind of sitting there scratching their heads and thinking, what am I doing tonight since I don't have a korban to give? Now Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling of the Exodus from Egypt, becomes the central aspect of what the Seder is. So now let's take a look. I'm going to share my screen, and we can look at my Sefaria Haggadah. But if you have your Haggadah with you, I think that it's nice to take a look at that, because especially if it's a Haggadah that you're hoping to use at the Seder. Okay, so I just have to move this and share this screen. So do you all see Sefaria? Can you just put a thumbs up that you see Sefaria and not Zoom? Great. Okay. Sefaria actually has a great Haggadah. Here, let me just give you guys a quick tutorial for those of you joining me. If you go, not from this group, because I know they all know how to do this, but if you go to Sefaria, let's go all the way back. Okay. If you go to Safaria, let's just type in Safaria as though we're going there. Not from my computer's memory. So if you go to Safaria, it says browse the library. You go down to liturgy, click on liturgy, and right there under the Siddur, I'm going to use the Ashkenazi Haggadah. And there you have all of the different elements of the Seder. And it's really, really great if you want to use that as preparation for the Seder, because you can click on anything and it will also give you links to everything, which is really nice. So now we're in Magid, the fun part of the Seder, the longest part of the Seder, where we start to get hungry. We've already looked at the Manishtana, that came from Mishnaic times. And now we're going to go to the story of the 5 rabbis. All right? So go to the story of the 5 rabbis, and most of you recognize this. This is such an interesting aspect. And, I could talk forever about how interesting this is in terms of telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, because it's essentially a Seder within a Seder. It's like a play within a play. We have a Seder within a Seder. So here we are, the rabbis kind of setting out how we should talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, how we should talk about the Exodus on the night of Passover. And all of a sudden we switch gears. Maaseh Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, Shayu Mesubim b'Bnei Brak, Vayu Mesaprim b'Yetziat Mitzrayim, Kol Oto Halayla, Ad Shebau Talmidim v'Amru Lahem, Rabotenu Higia Zman Kriyat Shema Shel Shacharit. Okay, so we have a story of these great rabbis. The rabbis, these are like the who's who of the Mishnah. These are the who's who of the Tanaim. The authors of most of the Mishnah are listed right here. Okay, and they got together in Bnei Brak, and let's dig a little bit deeper. And obviously, what is the point of telling us this? What is the point that they got together? If the rabbis are telling you that on the night of giving the Korban Pesach, the night of eating the Korban Pesach, you're supposed to talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim. And now there is no Korban Pesach, so the rabbis are trying to give you some guidelines as to how to talk about the Korban Pesach. Well, this is a good way to start, right? Because this tells us that the who's who after the destruction of the temple, they did this. They got together and they leaned, they relaxed, and they got together and they talked about Yetziat Mitzrayim. How long did they talk about it for? Wow. They talked about it all the way until Shacharit the next morning. And that's a way of them modeling, this is how you're supposed to do it. Okay? Let's take a look at how they're sitting. We do know that while the rabbis did a lot in order to counter assimilation into Greco-Roman culture, and obviously they wanted Jews to stay Jews and not get influenced by paganism and all of that. We know that there's no way of not assimilating somewhat. And so everyone agrees that this kind of picture of their Seder is based on the Greco-Roman type of symposium. And that's where the leaning comes from. I actually have a nice picture of it in my Haggadah. There's a nice, I forget who the artist is of this Haggadah. It looks like Schick, but it's not Schick. It's a nice, really nice illustrated Haggadah. So you have this idea that they're having this kind of really festive symposium and they're leaning together and they're discussing things together and they're sitting in a certain way. Okay, they're sitting like the way you would sit in a symposium. So based on a Greco-Roman symposium, who's at the center of the table? Who's the leader of the table? And it's not for nothing that this somehow resembles a little bit, lahavdil, the Last Supper. Who's at the center of the Last Supper? Of course, Jesus, right? Who's at the center of this symposium? It's Rabbi Eliezer, okay? Rabbi Eliezer is at the center, which tells us that this Seder that we're learning about here comes at the time when Rabbi Eliezer was the head of the Sanhedrin in Yavne. Okay, we're going to come back to that. Who's sitting on his right-hand side? Rabbi Yoshua. Okay, who's sitting on his left-hand side? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So that tells us that Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah are like the next in command after Rabbi Eliezer. Who's sitting on the side, at the right-hand side with Rabbi Yoshua? Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's student. And who do we have over on the left side? We have Rabbi Tarfon. Okay? So Rabbi Tarfon is an interesting character on his own, and we'll talk about him at some other point. Some of you have learned about Rabbi Tarfon with me. He's a little bit the rabbi who gets made fun of sometimes for making silly decisions. Rabbi Tarfon is actually interesting. I'll just mention Rabbi Tarfon was Rabbi Akiva's teacher as well. And Rabbi Akiva became so great in his time that Rabbi Akiva became Rabbi Tarfon's teacher eventually. So it's an interesting aspect there. Knowing something about post-Second Temple history, and in fact, knowing something about the Haggadah, who is missing from this table? Who is missing? And to put it more
Rabban Gamliel.
Very good. I mean, I was going to say, who didn't get invited to the Seder? Who didn't get invited to the Seder? And yes, it is Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel did not get invited to the Seder. And that's really quite remarkable. Because you have all the greatest rabbis sitting there, except for Rabban Gamliel. And Rachel, what would have tipped you off that it's a strange thing that Rabban Gamliel is not at the Seder? What would have, in terms of the Haggadah, what would have tipped you off that it's strange that he's not sitting with these guys? Well, I'll answer for you because I have something in mind. I'm doing one of those annoying things where I ask a question, even though I know exactly what I want the answer to be. The answer is that if we get to the end of Magid, who's the central character of the end of Magid? It's Rabban Gamliel. We're going to look at it. We're going to look at it together. He's the central character of he really takes center stage for what we do. But for the people who have been studying the origins of Tefillah with us, and this is why I wanted to kind of divert to Pesach, not just because it's coming next week, but also because Rabban Gamliel is the one who insists on standardizing the Shemona Esrei. And so we're going to see that he takes a very similar role with the Haggadah and with the Seder night. The same role that he takes with Tefillah, he also takes with the Seder. Now, don't think that Rabban Gamliel is totally out of the picture in terms of a Seder. What's interesting is I promised you that almost everything that we do in the Haggadah, almost everything that we say has some sort of rabbinic source. And in fact, you're going to see this little magic from Sefaria. If you click on the story that Rabbi Elazar says, the statement of Rabbi Elazar, after their introductions, if you click on it in Sefaria, and then you go over here to the side and you click on Mishnah, you find that it actually, this little paragraph here comes from the Mishnah, okay? Just like I told you, 90%, 80%, 70%. I'm not really bad with numbers, but a lot, if you ever want to go through the Haggadah on Sefaria and click on the different paragraphs, you will find that a lot of it comes from the Midrash or from the Mishnah. Okay, early rabbinic writings. Guess what, though? You can learn this together. We can learn this together through technology. If you click on the roster of who is at the Seder, it actually does not come from any Mishnaic source. The Sefaria gives us a quote from Psachim, but it does not talk about this Seder. And in fact, if we go back here and we go back to resources, there's no quote of this happening in the Midrash or in the Mishnah. We look at the Halakha, it just tells us what they're doing, that they're having a Seder and that they're reclining. This story has no rabbinic source, according to Sefaria, at least. Yes, Rachel.
I don't know whether it doesn't actually say they were sitting at a Seder. It just says
That's
they
right.
got to discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they should have been with their families and their children.
That's right. That's right. So we don't, but we actually, these words, Rachel, these actual words, we don't know what the source is because this next paragraph actually comes from the Mishnah. Sorry. This actually comes from the Mishnah, like we just saw, right? It's actually from Masechet Brachot that we're going to get to in a second. This is not in that Mishnah. This paragraph is not in that Mishnah. Okay. So obviously, my guess is that the people who put together the Haggadah, they're basing it on stories that were told. And my guess is that this was a story that was told. Do you remember the time when these rabbis got together and they talked about Yetziat Mitzrayim, and guess who was not there? Rabban Gamliel. Because we actually do have an early rabbinic source that says this. Listen to this. I don't have it up here, and it's going to get complicated if I look for it. But we have a Tosefta, which, as you know, is as old as the Mishnah. And that Tosefta says the following. Maaseh b'Rabban Gamliel uskenim, shehayu mesubim bebeit beitus ben zukin belod. Okay, we have a story that Rabban Gamliel got together with some elders, and they reclined, and it actually tells us who they were invited to. Beitus ben Zugin, who was a macher at the time, ben Zugin, a macher at the time. And where did he live? He didn't live in Bnei Brak. He lived in Lod, and we could have told Rabban Gamliel that probably isn't the nicest place to go for the Seder, but that's where he went while his companions maybe were in Bnei Brak. Vehayu asukin behilchot haPesach kol halayla. And they were talking about, they were busy, they busied themselves, they engaged themselves talking about Hilchot Pesach, the laws of the Korban Pesach, all night, ad karot hagever, until the rooster called, higbiu milifneim v'noadu v'halchu lahen lebeit midrash, and they realized that they had to go and say shacharit. So we actually do have this story. It sounds very similar to our story in the Haggadah, except Rabbi Eliezer isn't there, Rabbi Yeshua is not there, all of these people are not there. It just says Rabban Gamliel was there with this Kenyan. So it's not like Rabban Gamliel went without invitations, but what's interesting is that our Haggadah highlights a Seder where he is missing. And why is that so interesting? Let me just share a different screen with you. I just want to go through some of the, hold on a second. I want to go through with you some of the timeline of some of these people. So just we understand who Rabban Gamliel is and why it's interesting that he is missing. Okay. If we start with, and by the way, these dates are the approximate dates when these people were leaders. Okay. So we start with Hillel Hazaken. Okay. Hillel is like the leader, the rabbinic leader par excellence. All right. Hillel has the best hero story that we're not going to get into right now, but he was an outsider. He actually was from Bavel. He was not from Eretz Yisrael. And he comes to Jerusalem. And do you remember the story about Hillel? He was very poor. He was so poor, he wanted to learn in the yeshiva of Shmaya and Naftalion, and he didn't have money. They used to charge money. Well, I guess I charge money, but they used to charge money to get into the yeshiva, and he didn't have money. And so what did he do? He climbed to the rafters. He climbed to the top of the roof. And then the next morning they found him frozen. They found him frozen. He was so eager to learn that he was willing to listen from the rooftop. And it was one of those Jerusalem winters, and he froze almost to death. And they defrosted him, and they found out, wow, he's a genius. Okay, he quickly, from various different reasons, he quickly exceeds all expectations, and he proves to be a very innovative halachist. And he is called to be the leader. And of course, his nemesis is Shammai, right? Hillel, surprisingly, not surprisingly, Hillel, I don't think ever claimed this, but there was a claim that Hillel also, not only was he an outsider and not only was he poor, which is a great Torah story, but he also was descended from King David. That was the claim in the Babylonian Talmud, that he was descended from King David, which fit very well with the rabbinic antagonistic view of the Jewish kings, the Hasmonean Jewish kings. Remember, the rabbis never liked the Hashmonaim. Why didn't they like them? A, they were corrupt, that is for sure, but they didn't start out so corrupt. The rabbis were unhappy with them to begin with, like the Hashmonaim kings who came from the Maccabees. They didn't like the fact that they were both Kohanim and kings. There always was a checks and balances in the leadership, Jewish leadership. What was the checks and balances? In the time of the first temple, you had the Kohen Gadol, you had the chief Kohen, you had the king, and you had the Navi, you had the prophet. And that was a way of making sure that no one took too much authority, right? In the second temple, we didn't have prophets anymore. So there was an idea that you had the Kohen Gadol, you had the chief Kohen, you had the rabbi, and then now that we have sovereignty after Hanukkah with the Maccabees, then you have the king. But the rabbis didn't like that the Hashmonaim were both the Kohanim and the king. They felt like they were aggregating too much power to themselves. And so by saying that Hillel is descended from King David was also a rabbinic attempt to say, we are taking back that authority. We're taking back that monarchy, that line. Okay. Now, Hillel the elder by the way, doesn't, for as great as he is, he actually doesn't really make it into the Haggadah, right? We only have one reference to Hillel in the Haggadah, and that's the famous sandwich, which is a really, really nice story because it's the one story in the Haggadah that makes reference to what it was like to celebrate Pesach with a sacrifice. I happen to love that story because it's like having a little black and white photo of capturing a time that's gone by, capturing a quaint, beautiful celebration that Hillel could make this sandwich and just enjoy it. And I'm sure that the matzah that Hillel had was like the Yemenite matzah that we see today in Rami Levi and Osherad. Those lafa type matzahs. I just always imagine Hillel taking his piece of the Korban Pesach. He takes his piece of roasted lamb, barbecued lamb, puts it into that lafa type matzah, throws on mustard, which is maror, and it's a delicious sandwich. And you can just imagine how enjoyable it was. My mouth is watering just thinking about it, but it's just, such a beautiful picture of what the celebration was like. That's the one thing we hear about Hillel in the Haggadah, and he does pretty well actually, because we don't hear about Shammai either, and we don't even hear about Moshe. So the fact that those people are missing, it's a little bit interesting, but also they're in good company with each other. Hillel's son was nothing to talk about, Rabban Shimon. We don't hear anything about him actually. We have reference that he existed, and it could have been that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel and all the arguments that they had with each other overshadowed the actual son of Hillel. But his grandson was Rabban Gamliel, and his grandson was the only. We have to look at AI to confirm this, but I believe he's the only rabbi to be actually named in the Christian scriptures. Rabban Gamliel the first. He was a very powerful figure that came towards the end of the Second Temple, and his son Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was also someone who had quite a lot of stature in his time, and ruled for a pretty short time as the head of the Sanhedrin because he was killed. He was killed in the siege of Jerusalem. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was not related to anybody. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ruled at the same time. He was a leader at the same time as Hillel's great grandson, as Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and he also lived in Jerusalem at the end of the Second Temple. And it's with him that we have the famous story of being snuck out of the siege. Okay, Jerusalem has been taken under siege by the Romans. It's on the eve of the destruction. It's about to be destroyed. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, for better or for worse, changes the course of Judaism. He realizes that he has two choices. He can throw everything into supporting the rebels inside the siege, the rebels who are in Jerusalem in the Old City, or he can come to terms with the fact that destruction is inevitable. And he asks two of his students. Who are those students? Rabbi Yoshua, who's at the Seder, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who's also at the Seder. He asks them to sneak him out of Jerusalem in a coffin. This is a very famous story. And he gets to the general Vespasian, and he gives him some good Mossad MI5 level intelligence. And Vespasian says, "How can I thank you?" And Vespasian then becomes the emperor at that moment, according to the story. But he says, "How can I thank you?" And instead of saying to the question I would ask you is, what would you have asked? Vespasian says, "You have three things you can ask me for." In that moment, what would you have asked for? I know what I would have asked for. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "I know you're going to destroy Jerusalem. It's inevitable. Give me Yavne. Give us Yavne. Give the rabbis a place where they can have authority and centralize authority outside of Jerusalem and outside of the temple." The second thing he asks for is, help us maintain the Gamliel line. Okay? Rabban Gamliel II, over here you can see him, is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's student. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai throws his support behind his student because he recognizes that Rabban Gamliel, he's not a genius. He's great. He's fine. But he recognizes that Rabban Gamliel is the great-great-grandson of Hillel. And that means that he also comes from the line of David. And that means that he is the only person who's going to be able to centralize authority. Okay, I don't mean to be too irreverent, but I actually, it reminds me of a story personally. And I don't mean to get political, but I want to be able to illustrate this to you. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai understands that, and he has the foresight to understand that the destruction of the temple, the destruction of something so central to Judaism, and the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the place that is Hamakom, it is the central place of everything that happens in Judaism, is going to reverberate in a very negative way for the Jews. And he's looking for stability. He's looking for a way to power through and a way to continue to survive. And he has to make a very tough decision. He also makes a decision that he knows is going to be a decision that the Romans will support. Why will the Romans support this decision? Because the Romans want to destroy the rebels. They don't want to destroy the Jews. They come into this fight against the Jews and the temple because of the rebellion. The Jewish rebellion against the Romans was actually quite successful. According to Josephus, in that rebellion, the Jews killed something like 5,000 Roman soldiers. They killed an entire league of a legion of the Roman army. And so the emperor has to quell this rebellion, because once you have one place rebelling, it's a matter of time before you have the entire empire rebelling. The one thing the Romans want more than anything is stability. They want quiet. They want to collect their taxes and everybody to be quiet. So they hate those upstart Jews. They also, by the way, hate the new Christians because they're also rebelling. So what they want is quiet. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is buying them quiet. Move us to Yavne so that we can continue to have a semblance of leadership over the Jews, and continue with the Gamliel line, because the Gamliel line is a line that the Romans recognize. They knew Hillel, They knew Rabban Gamliel the first. They knew Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. They're like, okay, we can deal with this. We can deal with this kind of stability. It also is important for the Jews. And this is the story that it reminds me of. Shortly before my father passed away, my father lived a good long life. He died when he was almost 91. A few months before, I started to wonder if he was having some dementia. And I took him to our, many of you know Barry Rappaport, because he was a doctor in Netanya for a while as well, and now he lives in Zichron. He was my father's doctor, English-speaking guy. I took my father to see him. My father was living in Israel at the time, in Zichron, and I took my father to see him. And I said, Barry, I'm wondering what's happening. And Barry said, let me give him a dementia test. And so he started to ask my dad all these questions, like, what year is it? What season is it? What month is it? What day of the week is it? And there's like it's a standardized test. It's like the Haggadah. It's a standardized test of questions. And my dad surprisingly answered all the questions correctly. And then he asked him who the president of the United States was and all of this. This is about 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And Trump was president. And my dad knew that. And then Barry says, who's the prime minister of Israel? And my dad says, Barry, I only watch Fox News. I don't watch Israeli news. I don't know what's going on here. I can't tell you who the prime minister is. And Barry said, well, you know what, Svi, you're doing well on the test. Just tell me, take a guess. And my dad's like, no, I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to get it wrong. And Barry says, you know what? Just answer. Just guess. And my dad goes, I don't know. I'll guess Netanyahu. And and my dad and I just Barry and I, the doctor, and I just cracked up because that is the correct answer for the last 20 years, right? You can guess Netanyahu and you're going to be right. Same with the Gamliels, okay? If you would ask someone after the destruction of the temple or before the destruction of the temple, you just say to some schmo on the street, who is the head of the Sanhedrin? He may not know. And he would probably just say, I don't know, one of the Gamliels, because it was a line that you contended with. It was like, okay, or, was it Shimon ben Gamliel? They only seem to have one name. Was it Gamliel? Was it Shimon? One of the Gamliels, okay? And so there's reason why Gamliel became the head of the Sanhedrin, and a good reason why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gave up his own role so that Gamliel could continue. But I want to just go back now. Let's go back to our story. I want to go back to our story to point out why again it's so surprising that Rabban Gamliel is not at this Seder. And if we go back to our story, we will find that there was a short time when Rabban Gamliel got into a really big fight with Rabbi Yoshua. And I'm not going to go into the fight right now, but Rabban Gamliel, as we know from our Tefillah class, he, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, understood that after the destruction, there needed to be a focus on standardization and on a focus on how we're going to exist without the temple. And he ruled with an iron fist. It doesn't mean that he was elitist, right? We learned in the Tefillah class that he was willing to let Shimon the cotton picker decide what the 18 blessings were going to be for the Shemona Esrei. And we're going to learn that I think we learned this last week, that he let Shmuel HaKatan, Shmuel the small, either he was short or he also just wasn't the greatest Talmid Chacham. We don't know, but he allowed him to standardize the prayer against heretics. And we also know that he opened the doors for witnesses. Any kind of witness could come and testify about Rosh Chodesh. So it wasn't that he was an elitist. It was that he was very controlling. And now let's remember that he was a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I mentioned this before. Who else was a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? These two guys, Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And they were willing to put their support behind Rabban Gamliel. But remember, they were the same age. They were colleagues of Rabban Gamliel. And so when they saw the guy that they went to school with, the guy that went through yeshiva with them, the guy who was smart, but maybe not as smart as they were, their egos also got involved. And they would say, I don't know why he's taking so much control. And sometimes they would call him on it, and he would maintain control. Things got a little bit sketchy because he actually had a full-on fight with Rabbi Yoshua to the point where he embarrassed Rabbi Yoshua in front of the whole Beit Midrash. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer, for a short time, takes control. Rabbi Eliezer, who's young. Rabbi Eliezer is younger than everybody, but he takes control. And that's a story for another day, but I just want to give you some context on this story. If you want to get even more complicated, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is married to Rabban Gamliel's wife. And again, that makes it even more surprising that Rabban Gamliel is not at this Seder. Okay, so let's move on to what actually happens at the Seder. And as Rachel pointed out, maybe it wasn't even a Seder, but obviously whoever put the Haggadah together thought that this was some kind of Seder, and what tipped them off was this idea that they were misubim, that they were reclining. But this next part of the story may not even come from there. And in fact, if we look over here on Sefaria, and I'll see if I can actually share it with you, but this is the cool thing with Sefaria. You may not be able to see it on the screen, but you can see it if you're looking at Sefaria. This discussion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah doesn't even come from Masechet Psachim. It comes from Masechet Brachot, and it comes from the context of talking about Kriyat Shema. Okay, so let's just go through it quickly. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Harei ani kaben shivim shana. I'm like a 70-year-old. V'lo zachiti shetei amar Yetziat Mitzrayim baleilot ad shedarsha ben Zoma shene'amar leman tizkor et yom tzecha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. Yemei chayecha hayamim kol yemecha haleilot. So there was a tradition, and we're going to come back to this in the Tefillah class. There was a tradition of saying Shema for sure once a day. Once a day, saying Shema at Shacharit was considered to be a d'oraita mitzvah. It was considered to be a mitzvah from the Torah. And as we learned in the Tefillah class, Tefillah itself, the Shemona Esrei, is not considered to be from the Torah, but Shema, saying Shema, declaring Shema once a day is halachically, considered very important. But we know in our practice, in traditional practice, that a person is supposed to say Shema twice a day, okay? Once at Shacharit and once at Mariv. The question is, why at Mariv? Sometimes there's a tradition and we don't know where the tradition comes from, okay? Ben Zoma, who's just a student, by the way, he's not called rabbi, but this was part of the revolution of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah during the short time when he took over after Rabban Gamliel. He let a lot of students get involved in the discussion, which is why Ben Zoma is in the Haggadah, and people like Hillel and Shammai are not there. It was a way of lowering the entry fee into getting your moment of fame. And so Ben Zoma has his moment of fame. He's like we said, a lot of people may never have opened up a Mishnah or learned a Talmud, but you can talk to a lot of people and Jews in the world, and they'll know who Ben Zoma was, which is really interesting. So Ben Zoma has an interesting connection. He finds a biblical verse. He says, it says that you're supposed to remember the day you came out of Egypt, all the days of your life. It doesn't say days of your life. If it had just said days of your life, we would understand that to mean that you should say Shema in the morning, and that's it. But Ben Zoma says it says all the days of your life. Days of your life is the morning. All the days of your life is Mariv. It's nighttime. Okay? The Chachamim say, no, that doesn't make sense. The Chachamim read it as an eschatological, an end of a look into the future, a look into Messianic times. And the Chachamim say, no, this is not a proof, because It says kol yemei chayecha. When it says days of your life, it's not talking about when you should say Shema. It's saying that today in Olam Hazeh, in this world, you should be saying Shema. And kol yemei chayecha means that even in Messianic times, even in Acharit Hayamin, the end of days, we're still going to be saying Shema. And why would we continue to say Shema, even if we're in Messianic times? And this goes back to why we say Shema. And again, another connection to our Tefillah class. Why do we say Shema? And we're going to get to this after Pesach. What is the reason for saying Shema? And what does it have to do with Pesach? So I understand why the editors of the Haggadah would have put this story would have put this Mishnah into the Haggadah, because obviously both things are talking about Exodus from Egypt. The Shema talks about Exodus from Egypt, and the Haggadah talks about Exodus from Egypt. So it feels like it's the same topic. And yet, the reasoning is very different. The reasoning is very different. And this story really doesn't belong in our Haggadah. Because when we say Shema, why not? And let me ask this in a different question. Let me frame it in a different way. Why do we need a Haggadah? We have Shema. We say it twice a day. I mean, I don't say it twice a day, but people say it twice a day. You're supposed to say it twice a day. So why do we need a Haggadah? Why don't we just take a Siddur and say Shema at the Seder? What's the difference?
The Haggadah is also there.
Very good. You mean that the Haggadah is in the Shema, or the Haggadah is in the Haggadah? So what's the difference? Why can't we just say Shema? And I think what you're getting at, Rina, is that Shema is about remembering the Exodus from Egypt. It says Schirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's liskor. It's to remember or to mention. Okay, it's very individual. You are supposed to. Obviously, people go to shul and they say it in the community, but you say it to yourself, right? You say it. You mention it to yourself. You remember it. Why do you need to say Shema every day? Because Shema is part of that contract between the Jewish people and God. Shema is a way of saying, this is the God I believe in. This is Ol Malchut Shamayim. This is me saying I'm a Jew because I have faith in the God that took my people out of Egypt. It's about my relationship with God. Okay? The relationship with Yetziat Mitzrayim on the night of the Seder is very different. And as we learned with the Manishtana and what Rina just said, the relationship with Yetziat Mitzrayim is about telling, it's about discussing, it's about engaging. And so now let's go back to where Rabban Gamliel actually shows up. Okay, so we have this discussion where Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and these great rabbis are trying to figure out something about Shema. And in fact, the whole thing is phrased as you're going to be late for Shema. Okay, you're going to be late in saying Shema. And Shema is that moment of accepting that relationship with God. But we're going to see with Rabban Gamliel that that's not the point of the Seder. And that Rabban Gamliel, just like he does with the Shemona Esrei, he tries to standardize what is the point of the Seder. So if we go back, hold on. If we go back to the Haggadah in Sefaria, hold on, I'll try to go back to liturgy and I'll go back to Ashkenaz. Okay, we're still in Magid. Now we're done with the story of the 5 rabbis, and we're going to go to Rabban Gamliel's 3 things. Okay? So now Rabban Gamliel is not at that Seder, he's someplace else, and this is what he says. Rabban Gamliel haya omer, kol shelo amar shlosha devarim elu b'Pesach lo yatsa yedei chovato, ve'elu hen, Pesach, matzah, umaror. Okay? Rabban Gamliel says an astonishing thing. He says, if you don't say these three things, it's as though you didn't have a Seder. It's as though you completely missed out on the whole thing. Now, I just started cleaning yesterday, and if someone would tell me, you all of this, you could clean, you'll buy your shmura matzah, you'll, in the middle of a war, you'll make it to Osherad and to Rami Levi, you'll do all those things, and you'll sit there with the Haggadah and you'll say Kiddush, but guess what? Unless you say these three things, it's as though you did nothing. You did not pass the test. And then he goes on to explain why he thinks these three things are so important. Pesach, shehayu avotenu ochlim bezman shebeit hamikdash haya kayam. You're supposed to say Pesach because you're supposed to remember that this was Rabban Gamliel actually gave a Korban Pesach. He was alive during the Beit HaMikdash. And so he's saying to the Jews who no longer have a Beit HaMikdash, yes, we're going to remember what we used to do. Al Shuma, why did we have a Korban Pesach? Al Shum shepasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu al batei avotenu b'Mitzrayim. We had a Korban Pesach because God passed over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt. Now remember who he's talking to. Just take a moment to remember who he's talking to. He's talking to a generation that has lost, in their minds, they've lost everything. And the times when you realize you've lost everything is in the times when you're celebrating something that feels like a shadow of what it was. So I know for myself, for people who I've lost in my family, when do I miss them the most? Not so much on their yortzeit. I miss them the most at times when we would have gotten together. I miss them the most at a Pesach Seder, because I remember at the Pesach Seder, everything that we used to do together and the songs we used to sing and the things that the memories, the traditions that we built together. So this is a generation where they may not be mourning, they probably are also, but they might not be mourning people that they've lost. They are mourning the entire celebration that they lost. Pesach was the Hillel sandwich. Pesach was enjoying and kicking back and having a barbecue together. Pesach, the Korban Pesach and that celebration around the Korban Pesach was central to everything that they did. And Rabban Gamliel, the same guy who put together our Shmona Esrei, the same guy who standardizes things and says, let's move forward, he also says we have to move forward from here. You say the word Pesach. You're not bringing a Korban Pesach anymore, but you're going to say the word Pesach. And what does that word Pesach mean? He says, yes, we did have this Korban Pesach, but remember, that Korban Pesach was symbolic. It wasn't the central aspect of Pesach. It was a nice thing that we did, and we took 10 chapters in Tractate Psachim to talk about it, and the Torah talks about it. But remember, the central aspect of Pesach is Haggadah Lebincha. It was symbolic to remember what actually happened at the Exodus. And what happened at the Exodus was that God saved the Jewish people. He pasached. He passed over the houses and he saved the Jewish people. So the Korban Pesach is just a symbol. You've lost the symbol, but you have not lost the word. That story, that word, that experience still exists. Then he goes on to say matzah. Matzah, you're supposed to say the word matzah. Why? Al Shuma. Al Shum shelo hispik batzekam shel avotenu lahachmitz ad shenigla alem melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. So that matzah is not lechem oni. It's not a poor person's food. That matzah is also symbolic. You can take that with you outside of the temple. You don't need the Korban Pesach to have matzah. And that matzah is a sign of redemption. That matzah is a sign that nigla aleim melech malchei hamlachim, an emperor, a Roman emperor, a flesh and blood king may have destroyed your temple, but you were saved. Your forefathers were saved by the King of Kings. You have a contract with the King of Kings. And just like that King of Kings redeemed and saved your forefathers, that King of Kings is going to save you as well. You have the hope of redemption. And that's symbolized in matzah. And finally, maror. Maror, zeh she'anu oflim al shumma, al shum shemeru hamitzrim et chaye avotenu b'mitzrayim. Okay? That maror becomes the symbol of the difficult times that your forefathers had, meaning you may have some difficult times. We are living in difficult times, but difficult times have been experienced by Jews throughout the ages. And there are times, just like what you and I today, I'm looking at you guys today, the times of redemption that we're living in are similar to the time of redemption that our forefathers lived in, that our ancestors lived in. That it may have seemed hard, it may have seemed difficult, but it led to geula, it led to hope and redemption. And now the key part of the Haggadah, and we know this from the Mishnah, I'm going to click on it so that you can see. This key part of the Haggadah is also part of the Mishnah, and it's a quote from Rabban Gamliel. B'chol dor vador chayal adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, a person is supposed to see themselves as though they came out of Egypt. Going back to Rina's line, how do we know it? V'higadata livingcha. It's not about saying Shema. It's not passive. It's not you by yourself. It's a discussion. It's engagement. It's manishtana. Manishtana leads you to saying Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, and that leads you to feeling as though you experienced the Exodus from Egypt. So that no matter what generation you're living in, you could be living in our generation where we're in the middle of a war that is also hopefully going to lead to something great. Or you could be in the generation at the end of the Second Temple where they're like, we lost so much. And Rabban Gamliel is saying, no, you did not. You lost something now, but your reality is part of a different reality. We saw each other at Sinai. We were there at the Exodus from Egypt. You just need to bring it back to you so that you can feel that reality. And what do people do? What did the Israelites do? What is the first thing that the Israelites did when they left Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea? First, they complained, but before they complained, what did they do when they crossed the Red Sea? What is the first thing they did? They broke out into spontaneous song. They broke out into spontaneous Az Yashir. And one of the most beautiful parts of the Torah, this beautiful poem, this beautiful song. And they sang a song to God. And what do we do at the Seder, which was so unusual? We don't have another example of it in the entire year. What do we do after we talk about the Exodus from Egypt? Very unusual. We say Hallel. Even before we get to the soup, we start, and we're all starving. We sing praises to God. What would compel us? What would compel us to start Hallel? We don't have another example of saying Hallel in the middle of the night. What would compel us to say Hallel in the middle of the night? And again, it's Rabban Gamliel who says, you should be saying this. He's saying it to the people in his time, and he's saying B'chol dovar dor in every generation. And he's not some sort of prophet. He's not saying, I know what's going to happen to the Jews living in the 1700s or the 1800s or the 1900s, 20th century, 21st century. All he knows is that no matter when a Jew lives, and no matter what's happening in their lives, they use the Seder not to bring a korban. They use the Seder. The point of the Seder is to make it come alive for you. B'chol dovar dor. You're supposed to see yourself as though you left Egypt. And if you really succeed at doing it, you will be compelled to say Hallel. Your heart will say, I need to praise God, just like the Israelites praised God with Az Yashir. And the key to that is Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. He distills it. And so even though he doesn't get invited to the cool kids Seder, and even though some people have said, you know, he shut down arguments and he shut down debate. I think there's a lot to say about Rabban Gamliel as a leader, and finding a direction to to really give people a focus, an eternal focus that will last generations. And look how powerful his changes are in terms of the Shemona Esrei being central to how we speak to God, and the Haggadah being central as to how we fulfill the mitzvah of Sipor Yetziat Mitzrayim.